We begin this evening with Peter Jennings, who died last night at age 67 of lung cancer. Like so many today, I have thought so much about him since I heard the news this morning. We were friends for more than 25 years. He was a friend of the show. I know that because of how many times he will call me to tell me how it could have been better. This show was his kind of program. He loved history, he loved culture, and he loved talking about interesting people and smart ideas. We met in Washington in the late 1970s. Even then, he was a big deal and I was not, but he liked very much the fact that me, a young man from a small southern town, loved international affairs and had such curiosity and so many questions. At that time, I had no idea that I would be doing this program, and he would come as a guest 6 times, and that we would have 1,000 conversations over the phone and in person about everything. You will hear or have heard already the very good things said about Peter Jennings, his passion to learn, his elan, his love of a story, his standards, his desire to teach, and his self-confidence, and also his insecurities. I can't tell you how many times I received a call from his office at 11 in the morning saying, about last night's broadcast, why would you have him on? Did you know? Or he would say, you know who would be terrific? Someone he thought would be good, or someone he had just read about in the morning's papers. 2 things were constant about those calls. He loved the set that I have, or the lack thereof, and he always mentioned it. And he always complained about not enough supers, not enough telling the audience at home who the guests were. There was also this: if I was traveling around the world, Peter was as good as you can get. Going to Delhi, London, Beirut, Paris, he knew somebody that could help you. Going to Cairo, and he knew everybody. I care about friendship in all of its forms. Peter had one of the great qualities of a great friend. He cared about your life and your work, and he felt compelled to tell you what he thought, for better or for worse. And most of the time, you were better off if you listened. I need all the wise counsel I can get, especially now. Today I am minus a counselor and minus a friend, and they are very big shoes to fill. Peter died at age 67, knowing he had touched lives and served his profession and his friends and his family. Tonight we will hear from his friend Ken Oletta, his co-author Todd Brewster, and his colleague Mark Halpern, and we will revisit his time at this table. But first, courtesy of ABC News, here's a small part of an extraordinary professional life.
He had more than his fair share of natural gifts, an encyclopedic mind, a movie star's looks, a vast measure of curiosity, and the energy to pursue it to the ends of the earth.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
For his last 22 years, he was the sole anchor of World News Tonight, helping us understand the major events of our generation.
We are going to stay on the air until NASA tells us what it knows.
Someone actually reached up and handed me a small piece of the wall that they had chipped away.
Peter Jennings with the news.
Jennings was first made anchor of ABC's Evening News when he was only 27. He was a Canadian born in Toronto. His father was a prominent radio news reporter and anchor, and Peter hosted his own weekly children's radio show, Peter's Program, at the age of 9.
Was it your boyhood ambition to always be in broadcasting?
Without question.
He dropped out of high school before completing his sophomore year, went to work full-time in broadcasting in Canada, and then was hired as an ABC correspondent covering the momentous civil rights movement in the South.
At about 1:15 this afternoon, a lone Negro came down and tried to enter the Lester Maddox cafeteria.
In less than 2 years, he was promoted to anchor.
We cannot see them, but we can certainly hear them. The Israeli helicopters.
He left the anchor desk in 1968 to become a foreign correspondent in the Middle East. The bureau Jennings established in Beirut, Lebanon, and headed for 7 years, was the first American television news bureau in the Middle East.
We interrupt this program to...
His knowledge found a worldwide stage when terrorists took Israeli hostages during the 1972 Munich Olympic Games.
Peter Jennings is inside the village. Let's go to Peter now.
If I were to guess at the moment at which of the commando organizations this group is to come from, I'd be most likely to narrow in on a group called Black September.
Jennings brought his own expert knowledge into his decades of interviews with world leaders on issues that were timeless and some that cut straight to the deadlines.
Will you release the hostages, and when will you release them?
In the newsroom, his enthusiasm was palpable, applying the same energy to coverage of domestic issues that he had applied overseas.
We've come to Detroit for 2 days to focus on jobs and the American worker
And in one of the most exhilarating live broadcasts ever devised, Jennings stayed in his anchor chair for 24 hours to help welcome a new millennium. He was among a small group of witnesses who saw Saddam Hussein appear for the first time in an Iraqi court, and one of only 2 television journalists to witness the transfer of sovereignty to Iraq.
We're talking about massive casualties here at the moment, and we have...
He became an unforgettable presence on the one story that used every ounce of his reserve.
I almost lost it a couple of times on 9/11.
Well, scene has been repeated.
Most specifically, when I turned around to find that my children had called from 2 parts of the country, I think it made me think of a lot of families and their children. I checked in with my children, and who were deeply stressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up.
Peter had smoked most of his adult life.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this...
On April 5th of this year, he made an appearance on World News Tonight to explain why he had been absent from that show and from recent international events that colleagues knew he would otherwise have insisted on covering. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer.
I've been reminding my colleagues today, who have all been incredibly supportive, that almost 10 million Americans are already living with cancer, and I have a lot to learn from them. And living is the key word. The National Cancer Institute says that we are survivors from the moment of diagnosis.
ABC News President David Weston, in a tribute, wrote, "The void Peter leaves cannot be described. But as much as we miss him, Peter Jennings will always be with us at ABC News, in our history, in who we are, in what we do, in the stories we care about." As for how he viewed his role, he described it 40 years ago, when he was still on the verge of an epic career.
I'm fascinated by everything. There's just too much going on in too many places that I just daren't miss.
He meant every word, and then he lived it. The splendid journey that to him was so irresistible because it never ended.
You've been listening to the latest news from ABC Radio. This is Peter Jennings, ABC, New York.
Joining me now is Ken Ollett of the New Yorker magazine. He was a close friend of Peter Jennings for many years. They were neighbors on Long Island. I am pleased to have him here at a difficult moment for Ken and for everybody who knew Peter to talk about this man, this remarkable man. Tell me who he was as you saw him as a human being.
I saw Peter as very competitive. They all were for that story, chasing that story, and all looking over their shoulder. Is Tom here? Is Peter here? Is Dan here? And
Dan has the best line about that. He says, now, I guess, quoted today, "If I know Peter is in the same area code, I don't get any sleep."
But they, you know, they loved that competition, but they also hated it. It made them full of anxiety. But Peter was a guy, if you play tennis with Peter, he would try and ace you. He would try and slam the ball into the left corner when you were in the right corner. And oftentimes he would make mistakes because of that. Your game against him was to try and keep the ball in play and wait for him to
make a mistake.
But you know, he would dare to make those mistakes, and sometimes he would have magnificent victories because of it. But the same with cancer. I mean, I watched this guy. He determined right away when he learned he had this, you know, small cell lung cancer is pretty devastating, and the odds of success against it are minuscule.
More than 50% of the people who have it die within a year, I think.
Well, only 14% of the people who have lung cancer, any kind of lung cancer, survive up to 5 years. And we don't know how much longer they survive after that. And much smaller percentage who have small cell, which multiplies very fast. Peter, when he found out that that's what he had, opted for the most aggressive radiation and chemo treatment he could because he was determined to lick it. And when I said to him, Peter, tell me, when I visited him once at his apartment in New York, I said, what about your voice? You know, the raspiness that we saw when he announced he was stepping down or taking a leave in early April. He said, look, I can get my voice back through physical therapy. I'm not worried about that, through kind of therapy. He said, I've got to concentrate on a bigger battle, and that's against the big C. And that's what I'm concentrating on now, not on my voice.
He thought he could beat it?
I think he hoped he could beat it. I mean, they knew, their eyes were wide open, that the odds against them were great. Did he know he couldn't beat it? I don't believe so. I mean, even, you know, when I saw him last about a week ago in the country, and Casey, his wife, who's a magnificent, upbeat, spirited human being who made him enormously happy, she said to me, we know the odds, but we're determined to beat it. And she said they're going back in the day after I saw him for more chemo. So he was fighting to the end. And she was hoping for some kind of miracle, but they knew that the odds were against them.
When you have conversations with him, was he introspective about life and
we sat
the fragileness that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, sure, and took great pride talking about his kids. We sat on his deck about a month ago out in the country, and my wife and I visited him, and with Casey, and his kids were there, and we talked about everything. But we talked about journalism and its future. We talked about ABC.
He had some concerns about the future.
Oh, he did, and he enunciated these publicly. So I'm not telling tales out of school here. I wrote these. He worried, as did Brokaw and Rather and a lot of other people in our business, that infotainment was growing larger and larger in importance, and shrinking the importance of international news, particularly, but all news, and that if you had the Michael Jackson trial, or you had a runaway bride, or you had a missing teenager in Aruba, that was crowding out news of more gravitas,
right.
And that depressed him a lot. But he talked about, I remember him saying to me, he loved Charlie Gibson, and he talked about how Charlie was this great Capitol Hill correspondent in the early days when Charlie was Capitol Hill correspondent. He came to have great admiration for David Weston, the president of ABC News, who did a magnificent thing. I mean, if you think about it, journalists, a newsroom is the leakiest place on earth. It's much more leaky than the White House, for instance. It's certainly this White House. Yeah. And all the time, in the months that Peter has been on leave to fight the disease, you haven't seen one whisper of speculation about who's going to succeed Peter Jennings at ABC. You didn't hear about meetings held to discuss who's going to succeed him. David Weston went to Peter Jennings and said, let's renew your contract. 10 years. Yep. And
when?
And when Peter was ill this spring. And these people called him, sought his advice out, sought him out for his advice, welcomed him to to meetings, phone, the conference call, the news conference call in the morning. Peter never felt like an outcast throughout his illness, and as ill as he was, he felt that ABC was his family, and that's great credit to ABC. I mean, all these people, and you watch them. I mean, I saw real tears there today, and I think it was genuine.
There is that great story that he went over there not too long ago. And Charlie, I guess, into the broadcast now, saying for Peter Jennings and all of us at ABC News, good night or something.
And it's one of the things that touched him. That touched him, that they continued to do that.
And he said, this means a lot to me, but it touched his heart. He had the impression, because of his look, of being this great man of Elan. Tom even said today that he was the prince among us.
Yeah, I think Peter was the most natural broadcaster of the anchors.
And he came from that whole broadcasting tradition.
He came from that world, and they were all very good at what they did, and with different talents. But Peter had a smoothness an authority, a natural and an enunciation that was special. And
But I'm talking about more the style, the foreign correspondent, the way he dressed, the sense of...
Well, he had it in life. I mean, if you went, you know, when you went to visit Peter, when he was ill, he insisted on walking you to the door. That's Peter. Peter was just a gentleman. And you know, people can psychoanalyze it. Why was he a gentleman? Was it his mother, was his father, was it insecurity? Who cares? I mean, he was just a gentleman. And he had a natural elan. I mean, and if you watched him in a room with a lot of famous people in that room, and everyone is making a beeline for all the celebrities in that room. And what did Peter Jennings do? He would see a vulnerable teenager. He would see a vulnerable spouse, someone who felt a little awkward or uncomfortable in that room with all these celebrities. And he would talk to them. And he wouldn't just talk to them by providing them an audience. You throw questions at me. He would ask them questions and make them feel comfortable. And the truth of the matter is that every celebrity in that room wanted to go talk to Peter Jennings, but he was taken. His eyes weren't darting about. He was talking to that teenager. And it was extraordinary to watch him do that. And I think he just had was that because he was a gentleman? Yeah, it was because he was a gentleman, but also he was genuinely curious about people and liked people, and I think had particularly liked people who were vulnerable. And maybe he felt some vulnerability in his life, growing up in the shadow of a famous father in Canada, but dropping out of high school.
Yeah, but here, there was this contradiction which was interesting. We talked about this on the first interview we ever did. On the one hand, it used to be this notion that it was speculated about, that Peter had a certain insecurity because he didn't finish college, didn't go to college, and therefore the passion to self-educate himself. On the other hand, there was this enormous self-confidence that he had. I mean, they all three have self-confidence, but Peter uniquely had this sense. I know it because how many calls I would get from him about what he saw on this broadcast.
Peter was really insatiably curious. I mean, when I first met him...
And confident.
Oh, he was confident, but not as confident as he sometimes... I think he felt vulnerable, and part of being a good journalist is to feel, I think, to be somewhat insecure. You're insecure about, do I have the answers? Yeah. You're insecure enough to ask questions.
Right.
And he had that. But when I first met him, when he came back to the States as an anchor 2 decades ago, and we lived not far from each other in Long Island, in the Hamptons on the Weekend House, he would always ask, what should I be reading? What's current? And part of that was curiosity, part of that was insecurity. In recent years, you wouldn't hear Peter ask, what should I be reading? He'd be out there looking for what he should be reading, and he'd be reading. He read a lot.
And be telling you what you ought to read.
Well, he would do that too,
because he'd read something.
Yeah, he read, and he would share it, but he had that ability, but he had something else that as a journalist, I really admire. When you write about people, and I've written things about Peter that didn't make him happy, including a book I wrote about the networks some years ago, and I described Peter, what it was like to work for Peter at World News Tonight. He could be a micromanager, he could be persnickety, right. And he could be difficult and brusque with his staff. And I wrote that. I also wrote about how talented he was, etc. But a lot of people, when you write something critical, you brace yourself when you see them or you hear them on the phone, and you say, oh, they're going to whine, or they're going to attack, or they're going to complain, and you know, you got to listen to it, and sometimes they may even be right, and so you listen to that. Peter never said a word of complaint. He understood that I was doing my job just the way he thought he was doing his job when he reported. And you take the good and the bad. That's what journalists does. So in his gut, he understood the nature of journalism, and he had an ability to climb outside of himself and see that this is not about Peter Jennings' star. It's about what journalists do. And I'm fair game because I'm Peter Jennings, and that's the way the world works. And I thought he was magnificent about that. He was a Democrat with a small d.
But he took back to the cancer. He took it understanding that it was a battle for his life.
Yeah, but it was a battle, and he was gonna compete against it and try and beat it if he could. And if he couldn't, he would go out fighting.
And a recognition that he'd lived a good life.
Oh, I think he lived. You know, he had a couple things happened in the last decade of his life. One is that he went through a somewhat messy divorce with Cathy Martin, and they had a fractious relationship, and they had two magnificent kids, Christopher and Elizabeth.
The gossip went crazy.
And the gossip columns, and it was a tough moment for all of them. And later he married Casey Freed, who was a producer at ABC, and she made him really happy. He was really gloriously happy, and the kids accepted her from his marriage with Cathy, and Cathy accepted her, and so Casey brought something to his life that he loved. But something else happened in the last months of his life that was extraordinary and inspiring. Cathy Martin, his former wife, and he, who had been semi-estranged, they dealt with each other about the kids, they had a rapprochement, and it began because her father came here, he was not well, and Peter, unbeknownst to Cathy or anyone else, would take her father out for lunch because he loved her father, his former father-in-law. And Cathy found out about it. And they began, and she called him, just really shaken by this and moved by it. And they began a rapprochement, became friends again. And then when he got ill, Casey Freed, Peter's wife, invited Cathy up to be part of the family, consoling and helping and working with Peter and the kids. So it was a closure of his former life and his present life that was really inspiring, and so he left lots of families when he died, and but I'm happy he had that closure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
General Letter. Back in a moment, Peter Jennings, An Appreciation. Joining me now are two people who worked closely with Peter Jennings for many years. Todd Brewster is a former editor for Life magazine. Together, he and Peter wrote two books, The Century in 1998 and In Search of America in 2002. Also joining me is Mark Halprin. He is the political director for ABC News, where he worked with Peter Jennings for 17 years, and especially closely during election years and primary time. I am pleased that they take time to come here this evening and remember Peter Jennings as a colleague who they worked with and in Todd's case wrote a book with. What do you on this evening, 24 hours after his death, want the world to know about a guy that you knew so well?
Well, I would like them to know a couple of things. Just what a warm and tender human being he was. He had this air of erudition and this quality of sophistication to him that sometimes I think made people think he was cold. He wasn't cold. He was a very warm person who attached himself very dearly to his friends and did everything he could for them. He had a good, strong heart. He felt things very deeply. On a personal level, I would like that to be known about him and remembered about him. On a professional level, I'd like it to be known that he had extremely high standards, and that he really challenged the industry, and this is, I think, what Mark was referring to before, and what Ken referred to before. Challenged the industry, challenged the people that work with him to maintain a certain level of responsibility in the work that they did. Something that, with the passing of this generation of anchors, I'm not sure is ever going to be demanded in the same way again. I mean, there's hours of documentary television that are produced at ABC that are written into his contract, and it's only because he's there that those hours are being produced. I'm not sure there's ever going to be another anchor in the next succeeding generation of television that can command that kind of respect.
And you?
In the best traditions of PBS, I'll say the same things in a different way.
All right.
All the things Todd said about how warm he was and how the public image somewhat masks that are absolutely true. But all I would add is to be able to maintain that, given the celebrity and the fame and the power, I think is extraordinary, because he was not pretentious. He would travel with them around the country, as I had the honor to do, and he would treat people genuinely, not because he was afraid if he treated them badly, he'd get in trouble in the newspapers. He genuinely liked talking to people. And to be able to maintain that curiosity and that affection for people, strangers and his friends, is incredible. In terms of, and so that's the personal. In terms of the professional, Peter's success occurred over his entire career, but his greatest success occurred in the 90s when the program was a commercial success, and when the standards in much of the news business, major news organizations throughout this country, declined. O.J. Simpson trial, missing women, murder, celebrity murders, the tabloidization, the lowest common denominator of the media, the profit margins being demanded, changed what most news organizations were willing to do. And Peter repeatedly at ABC News said, we're not going there. We're going to have high standards. We're going to cover serious news. We're going to resist the temptation to follow the pack. And that had an effect not just on ABC, but I think on other news organizations, because they saw what Peter was doing, what ABC was doing, and they said, it's only so far down we can go before we can't look at ourselves in the mirror. And to do that, to have the courage to do that and the persistence to do that is something that I think history will show was really important. Because if we still have standards, I think he deserves a lot of the credit for it.
Peter have any unrealized aspirations? Did he long to do something, be something?
Well, he and Casey were working to have more of an independent production company.
Right.
And to be in
PJ
business
Productions
together.
or something.
Yeah, to be in business together. And they would talk so enthusiastically about, they'd come up with an idea for an hour or a program or a film, and they'd talk about it and how it would be produced. And he definitely wanted to do more of that.
There is this question of legacy. What's the legacy?
Well, what I said before, he kept the standards up in one of America's most important news organizations during a time, which is ongoing, unfortunately, when there's a pressure to cover less serious news more of the time. That'd be one. Another is he's worked with and trained a generation of broadcasters and producers who are not just at ABC now, but unfortunately some have spread their wings and gone other places, who he has touched directly, made them better writers, better journalists, better producers. I think also he worked on a lot of issues in a very smart way because he cared so much about this city and this country and this planet. He worked on homelessness and AIDS, to name two issues he worked on a lot. Issues that you could work on as a journalist without feeling you were crossing a line of saying I'm being partisan or ideological. And he worked on those, raised money for them, raised awareness, made stories about them in a way that few journalists can do and do. So those are three I'd pick out.
Talk to me about the last, since April.
Well, it's been a very hard time at ABC. The reality is that all of us are journalists, so first day we could all go and Google lung cancer and know that the odds were not great. We all had great faith in Peter's strength, and we all very much wanted him to come back because he is so important to us, and still is. It has been awkward and strange and left a lot of people in a daze because it's been an in-between period. I'm not sure what will happen now. ABC's strength derives from a lot of things, but make no mistake, for many decades, a lot of it derived from Peter. And now we're going to have to figure out how do we replace that? Where does it come from? Knowing, as Todd said, that elements of what's Peter's strength cannot be replicated in this day and age. We'll never have that.
There is finally this, the extraordinary role that Casey has played, especially since the illness, but how she changed his life and how she has been at his side when you desperately need somebody at your side that you trust.
Well, Casey is an extraordinary partner, and I think Mark would agree that the difference between Peter before Casey and Peter after Casey is to see a happy man.
Now, what was the difference?
Whatever it was of their love together made him into a happier person. I mean, he became a night and day, I think. I mean, I remember the days before that, and it was different. It was a different place.
Happier and focused on things that made him happy. Not just practically day to day, although she's great at that, but also a life together where you see where you're headed together in a way that the things that are important, family, his kids, the work that they enjoyed together, was the focus and center of their lives, and some of the more peripheral stuff pushed to the side.
She's a good producer, and a good producer was somebody I think you needed to have by your side fighting the battle he fought the past few months. I mean, I think, she certainly was a good partner, a good soldier working with him in this, I think Peter had, in many ways, a charmed life, and I think that in these last months, he certainly had the blessing of people around him who loved him dearly and helped shepherd him through this on to the next void.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back in a moment. Peter Jennings. Do you think of yourself as an American, or you do?
I think, yeah. I think of myself more, again, it depends a little bit. I think you are what you are to start with. I always love to tell the people a story about being in Iran during the revolution. And when the hostages were taken, everybody in town wanted not to be American, they wanted to be Canadian. And so they handed out all these Canadian pins, and everybody in the press corps wore Canadian pins. And then Ken Taylor, the Canadian ambassador, rescued the 6 Americans, and they hated Canadians, so everybody took their Canadian pins off. The answer is, I think if you're a journalist, you are, for the most part, a citizen of the world. You have the opportunity to be one, certainly. I certainly hope my children will be citizens of the world. I think they're both born overseas. I think they will be inclined to be. But there are ways in which you think, I think, one or the other. I think deeply about America in terms of the Declaration of Independence, in terms of the Constitution. I carry the Constitution in my pocket all the time.
And so you also make a point that in no other place do people say it's unconstitutional.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah. I'm actually not the first to think of that by any means, but it is. You don't hear the "un" word in any other society like it's un-American or it's unconstitutional, where it's often used as one, as a professor, I think at the University of Chicago pointed out many years ago, with almost the damnation of an accusation. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. Well, for you, what does it mean to be an American, you think? Because frequently, I mean, I think de Tocqueville said, these people, to be what they are is not about what it is to be a European.
Right. I think what it does mean, and has meant really, I think, since the Founding Fathers, de Tocqueville picked it up in the 1830s when he came here for this very brief journey. And by the way, caught very quickly in the 1830s the difference between Canadians and Americans, stepped over the border quite briefly. But the Founding Fathers had the idea that this was to be an idea. Immigrants were welcome. Ben Franklin wasn't altogether certain about certain immigrants, but the idea was that you came as part of an idea. And I think that's very much alive today. To be an American is to be an idea, and America is a creed in some respects, as some people have said before, whereas to be German or to be Japanese or Chinese is to be a fact.
Well, interesting about that is that foreigners have helped us understand ourselves as much as people who were born here, not only de Tocqueville, but also Gunnar Myrdal. And you point out, you know, recently because of the conviction of the man involved in the church bombing that killed the 4 young African-American women, it's a time to say race is still our dilemma, as Gunnar Myrdal told us.
And it was certainly the Founding Fathers' dilemma, and argued by far wiser people than me, that they didn't get it right. You know, Jefferson, talking about once having the race issue, I think he said, like having a wolf by 2 ears. You know, justice was on, you couldn't let the wolf go. Justice was in one hand and self-preservation was on the other. And therefore they, you know, this was a slaveholding society, a white slaveholding society, and so they left it to the next generation. I just simply wanted to remind the kids that it's now their generation. And it is still our dilemma.
How do you think we changed because of September 11th, 2001?
I think the first thing I would say is that you can't generalize. And I'm
There's
even
no
a little embarrassed on occasion when people say, have you changed profoundly? And they ask the question as if you clearly have changed. And to be honest, I'm not sure that I have. And I think the country has been changed, but I don't think it's changed in elemental ways. I think the country is still strong, vigorous, stands for the same things. The arguments are still about the same things. The John Ashcroft, George Bush policy on human rights and civil rights, and the latest John Ashcroft proposal that they will argue gun control before the Supreme Court, are simply, whatever you may think of their policies, are reminders that we continue to battle about the elemental ideas which were the founders. And so in that respect, I don't think the country has changed dramatically. I've been very struck watching, I watched the HBO thing on 9/11.
In memoriam.
Yeah, in memoriam, which I thought was absolutely stunning.
I did too. We
absolutely
sat
stunning.
and watched it, and I don't think anybody could watch that without being
Well, a friend of mine who went to a screening said, you know, be sure you don't watch it alone. And indeed, I watched it with my wife and my sister, who was here from Canada. And my sister, who has a different view of America, just totally gripped by this. And it is a reminder of, you know, of the way we were all traumatized and invigorated and, you know, divided in some respects, brought together in other respects. And we're going to try this, as you mentioned. We're going to try this on December the 18th, of trying to review this for 18 hours. Yeah. It's a long time.
But you were on the air for how many hours on
I was
the
on
actual
the air
day?
Forever and ever and ever and ever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, but it was straight through for about...
Which in some respects, I think, Charlie, and I've heard other reporters say this, in some respects I think may contribute to the why we haven't been changed. Because reporters and anchors and editors were so focused on what they were doing that in some respects I think we were insulated from the agony,
the emotional experience others were going
which
through.
the other people were going through.
It's a little bit like in a stretch, but it's a little bit like if you're so focused. I mean, you talk to people who do amazing things, heroic things, and they do it not because they're thinking about, I'm doing something heroic here. You're just doing it. You know, and so you're divorced from actually what you're from the reality of the event outside of you, because you're focusing on the job at hand.
I think you're right.
But there is certain things that seem to have changed. One is that we realize our vulnerability, you know, which is a present of our life.
I thought of it before. You see, you mentioned that I work in a lot of different places, and so have you. I think anybody who'd been a foreign correspondent, who worked in Ireland, who'd lived in London, who'd lived in Beirut, who'd lived in Rome, I have seen. That sounds I don't mean that as strongly as it comes out. I've seen societies at vulnerable before. So I actually thought...
That's my point, though. But we've seen societies, but we hadn't thought of our own society. I hadn't, as being vulnerable in that way. I mean, this brought it home in a remarkable, piercing,
well, I
don't
wish to portray myself as particularly wise in this regard, but I did think on the day it had happened. That I was shocked. Who could not be shocked? And who could not be shocked at the magnitude of what somebody in the government, I think, referred to as this, you know, this magnificent crime, because it was Tom Ridge, the Director of Homeland Security. I once asked him, I said, what do you think of the quality of this crime? He said it was a phenomenal operation. So we were shocked by that. But the fact that terrorism was visited on this side of the Atlantic, don't forget we had it in Quebec in the 60s, so I wasn't deeply surprised by that.
Before I leave 9/11 too, it is this notion of today's events. Do you believe that 9/11 in a sense reminded us of how we need a heart to come to at a time like this? And that's what ABC News and CBS News and NBC News do for us at a moment of great crisis, and we were reminded of that.
I think it's probably not becoming of me to say it.
I know.
But I was reminded at the time of the Challenger disaster. I was when I did the Challenger disaster, I was on the air for 11 hours. Tom Brokaw and I were actually together in the White House when it occurred.
Why were you there?
We were going to have lunch with the president.
Oh, I see. That's what anchors do, America. We have lunch with the president.
It's actually part of what administrations do to schmooze anchors before States of the Union.
Right.
And we just, both of us, took off like scalded cats to our respective bureaus in Washington. I was on the air for a little more than 11 hours. I remember going back to my hotel that night to find the Bulldog editions of the New York Times and the Washington Post. Huge, huge editions. And I thought, oh my God, this is enormous. I had no view of this, of course, when I was on, because I was so focused on what was doing. And I got quite nervous. I went up to see Dan Borston, who was then the Librarian of Congress, and I said, explain this to me, this phenomenon. And he said, you know, it's like in the days of the frontier. Something happened to the wagon train. They pulled the wagon trains around the campfire, and they talked about it, and then they resumed their life the next day. And on the air on 9/11, I, at one point, found myself telling this story to the audience, which, by the way, one of the very few, it was a very emotional experience for me in a couple of places. And I remember telling this story and realizing that the electronic hearth is where we gather in times of tragedy. And it is a huge honor and a slightly awesome responsibility on occasion for people to be, you know, the director of the campfire at that point.
It also reminds us, and I say this about you and about Tom, about Dan, and about others, that you guys, there's a big story, some magazine, New York Times magazine, I guess it was, written by Frank Rich, and there you are. In a sense, come to this job. This is what they pay you for, in a sense. I mean, other than being there day in, day out, and ratings and all that. They pay you because they expect you to have had the experience and the kinds of know-it-all to be able to handle this kind of moment, as it began with Cronkite at the time of Kennedy's assassination. I mean, that's what being an anchor, in its best sense, is about.
I think, listen, I've been very lucky. ABC has given me a huge education. It's lasted more than 30 years. All the education, as you pointed out,
it's the best
I didn't get in school.
Have.
But I am always, thank my lucky, there's nothing worse in the world. Oh, shouldn't I take this back? There's nothing more frightening in the world for an anchor person to go on the air and have to anchor something about which they know nothing. Exactly. And I've been there. I've been there.
What would that be?
I remember Black Tuesday, a stock market crash. You know, I'm looking at can you get me your high school book on economics? It was really hard.
Somebody in your ear saying, it's too late, Peter, we'll walk you through this.
That's right. And you rely tremendously on the people you have in your ear, and part of the job, of course, of the anchor person is to knit together a sort of team. But I kept saying to myself, as we went through 9/11, very privately on occasion, oh man, thank God. Just thank God I'd been to these places. Been through this.
Because we've seen people who've sat in anchor chairs who are not prepared for it. I mean, and that it shows.
It's not always their fault, by the way.
Well, I know, but it shows. I mean, that clearly shows. I mean, that is, in fact, why each of you have that. I want to talk about today's headlines with you while you're here. You've spent more time than most American, by far, looking at the Middle East. Here is one more Arab bombing in Israel deepens a sense of dismay. The dismay is there anything that will lead to the sense of desperation on both sides? There's another story in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, about how the administration is giving consideration, I'm sure you read that too, is giving consideration to the idea perhaps, like President Clinton did, this administration should lay out where it thinks they ought to go, having to do with borders, having to do with Jerusalem, having to do with refugees, having to do with occupied lands, having to do with settlements, all those things. You know this region. You know?
Well, one knows it. You know, one knows it. One is constantly surprised. What was the phrase you used earlier? Not despair, not surprise. Dismay.
It says dismay. Yeah.
Dismay.
A sense of dismay that. Let me jump in before you answer. Dismay that, after all, you know, they've had a whole rash of suicide bombings since the so-called, ceasefire. Not that Israel didn't say it was going to happen, but. I mean, is it going anywhere?
Clearly, I think the first reminder for the Israelis in this instance is that the use of force, as they did when they went into the West Bank, is not the only solution, and that I don't know of anything that's ever been resolved in the Middle East over a long period of time, you know, by force. After all, the Israelis were winning in the 1973 war against the Egyptians, and you know, they ended up giving Sinai back, and you may argue it's a pretty cold peace at the moment between Israel and Egypt, but it took diplomacy. This would not be the first administration to lay out a roadmap of where it has to go in the future, and the Israelis, I'm sure, many I know well, do not believe that you can put up a wall between the Israelis and Palestinians and eliminate suicide bombers. I also think it's not really helpful for the argument if we don't think of the suicide bombing having been preceded by 35 years of occupation. So you can't pretend, I think, that one is totally unrelated to the other. And you cannot just it seems to me, lock the Palestinians into an enclave or into, as you hear more increasingly these days, into some kind of Bantustan and expect it to not, you know, bleed through continuously into your society. Israel is the more powerful society, and so always has that edge. I believe, I've heard so many people on your program talk about this, and as I listen to them and argue with them at this other side of the screen sometimes.
Wishing you were sitting here rather than
me.
Well,
no, not at all. In the country, I mean, it is the subject which engrosses so many of us. I actually continue to believe that the Israelis and the Palestinians will one day live side by side, independently, with their own reason for being. I've always believed that. I believed it when I first went to the region in the 60s. I continue to believe it. It is as dark now as it has ever been before. And I've similarly believed that only the United States, and we've seen it so many times, only in the United States can foster progress, particularly now. Now, I don't know altogether what the Bush administration will have in mind, but I've always believed that it was mandatory for the U.S. to be involved, and that peace and justice must apply to the Palestinians as much as they apply to the Israelis.
Foster, meaning what? What should the United States?
Well, I think you said it. I think it would be very helpful if the United States put on the table again. I think you have to keep doing it over and over and over again. After all, what is the consequence of not putting it on the table over and over again and trying over and over again? I mean, I appreciate, as best one can at this distance, how desperate it must be for Israelis who now live with a measure of uncertainty and anxiety and fear that they were not experiencing a year ago. Remember, Israelis and Palestinians don't have much contact with each other. The overwhelming number of Israelis see Palestinians only in the service industry, and therefore have not been, many of them have not paid much attention to Palestinian ambition, what the Palestinians want for themselves. And the Palestinians who, there's a piece in the Financial Times this weekend talking about how the Israelis are currently locking up and crushing, in some respects, the economy in the Palestinian territories. That can't continue either, because that will simply lead to more and more anger. So who else to come along with the United States and say, hey, let's try this, I got these 9 things, let's try these 9. That doesn't work, we'll try these 8. I mean, I think it is one of the things the United States does as a world power, the only world power of significance in this regard now, as despite the antipathy to the United States in the Arab world at the moment as being seen as too pro-Israeli, but after all, deeply appreciated in many ways as the potential power broker in the region.
There is no escaping that reality from everybody concerned.
So.
That was the reason that the Crown Prince went to Crawford to say,
and I don't think you can,
I'll do my part if you do your part, but now the Crown Prince doesn't feel like...
And we see it go back and forth all the time, too. You get an administration that is seen to be sort of more on the conservative right-wing side of the Israelis than on the left-wing side. But ultimately, I believe there is a peace and justice for both sides. And you may call me naive, but I think there is.
Okay, but I'm not sure naive, but I mean, what is it that gives you that belief? Simply because in the end, all human beings want to do pretty much the same thing. They want to have a family, they want to have security, they want to see their children do better than they did, and they want to live in peace. Is that it?
I know there's a lot of argument about what is taught in the respective schools, whether you get taught more to be an anti-Arab in a conservative school in Israel, or you get taught to be an anti-Israeli in a Palestinian school. But I'm always struck when I see these pictures of the Palestinian kids in school uniforms about what we're struggling here. And you say to yourself, you know, there's another generation that wants to be educated. And you have to insert yourself somehow. We all have to be inserted in some way that they don't get to the point where they are angry, desperate, frustrated, anti-Israeli.
I mean, the interesting thing about this is that if, in fact, the United States plays the role and begins to lay out, I mean, if you take the position that was laid out by President Clinton, which some believe is where the peace that eventually will end up, you know, 67 boundaries, you know.
Yeah, I would have said, for example, because your audience is very familiar with it, that what the Israelis and the Palestinians agreed at Taba, you know, got close to in Taba, was even better than what they got at Camp David, and the timing was very bad, very tough for Arafat at the time. But I know Palestinians and I know Israelis who think that they'll be back, but I wouldn't say they were in the majority.
But I mean, but we now have a prime minister in Israel who says, you know, hey, I'm not even going to say that I'm in favor of a Palestinian state anymore. I'm not going to say that, you know, I definitely am not in favor of the things that were laid out there. I mean, you've got a long way to go. Here is my question. Clearly, the United States has to face up to a certain political will. Where do we lean, and what, you know, how far is the Congress and all of the political forces in America? The other question has to do with the Palestinians. Do you believe that Arafat has been acting in the best interest of the Palestinian people over the last 18 months, 2 years?
No.
What has he done wrong?
I think it's been longer than that. I think longer than that. I think the Palestinian Authority, you know, was corrupt in many ways. and that Arafat has not been able, he's not the first, not been able to make the transition from revolutionary leader. He was, if you go back, 20, 30 years, he's the father of the Palestinian Revolution in many respects, and has not made the transition. But that's compounded, it's made more difficult by the fact that the more pressure the Israelis put on the Palestinians or put on Yasser Arafat, the more inclination there will be in the community to defend the underdog, if you will, under those circumstances.
And he gets more approval from defiance than he does from submission.
What I actually find surprising at the moment is how outspoken the Palestinians have been opposed to Arafat.
Well, that's what I'm getting
when
to.
Given the mere whisper of the possibility of reform inside the territories.
You brought me exactly where I was going. How much is there going on based on the people that you know there when you were there, what, a month ago?
I think a great deal. I think there's a great deal going on in the Palestinian community. There always has been. There is a core of middle-class Palestinians who, as you point out, and anybody who knows the parties points out, want exactly the same thing for their children and their children's children as do people in Israel. But putting Arafat aside is not so easy when you have Mr. Sharon doing what he's doing, and you have the U.S. Congress doing what it's doing, and you have Hamas, to which Israel turned a blind eye, as we both know, for many years. I mean, we all know how complex it is, especially your audience.
Well, tell me about Your Day, which is part editor.
You have to talk about this.
Part PR. I'm getting to it.
It's hard to get an audience on ABC these days.
We're getting to it. We're creating interest before we get there. Your Day. You arrive at the office at what time?
Well, anywhere after 8 o'clock. Okay. I mean, we have our first editorial meeting at 9 o'clock. I start working at home, obviously, but I get there pretty early. I was in the newsroom when the plane hit on 9/11. I suppose that's a pretty good example of when I get there.
So you get there right around 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And what's the first thing you do? I mean, you have a cup of coffee and you read the papers?
No, I've already read the papers, and I've already gone online. I've already sort of communicated with the rest of the world, and I've also done my email to some extent, which is the way we interact a lot at home.
With 20 people? With how many people?
No, more with the senior editors, particularly with the foreign editor because of the time zones. Tom Nagorski is our foreign editor, and he's been up even earlier than I have, because the rest of the world is that much ahead.
Most of this communication is email.
Before we get to the office, certainly. And then we have our first editorial meeting at 9 o'clock. Then we go to work. And as I think I did say in that article, I spend part of the day as a writer, part of the day as a rewrite man, part of the day as a producer, part of the day as an editor, part of the day carrying the company flag on occasion, part of the day working on documentaries, part of the day working on the book. Yes, it's a full and very enriching day. And at the end of it, yes, at the end of it, one sometimes, and then I go and read the news for half an hour.
For 30 minutes, you read the news.
Right. Yeah.
And many people think you just show up at the studio at 6:30 and read the news.
There are days I'm tempted.
Peter Jennings, dead at 67 years old, much, much, much too young.